Long before today's giants dominated, unique regional chains like Royal Castle, Showbiz Pizza, and Howard Johnson's dotted the landscape. This video explores 20 forgotten fast food and restaurant brands, from pioneers like Childs to cult favorites like Farrell's. Let's uncover their stories, signature offerings, and why they ultimately faded away. Remembering Showbiz Pizza and the Rock-afire. If you were around in the 80s, especially with kids, this name probably brings back some vivid memories. Launched back in 1980, thanks to Robert Brock and the wizards at Creative Engineering, Showbiz was this incredible mix. Hot pizza, a sea of blinking, bleeping arcade games, and the main event, those animatronic shows. They exploded onto the scene, eventually hitting about 280 locations nationwide during that peak arcade restaurant craze. But you gotta remember, the absolute showstopper, the thing that made Showbiz truly unique, was the Rock-afire Explosion Band. These weren't just jerky robots. They felt alive, putting on a real show that, let's be honest, kind of blew Chuck E. Cheese's band out of the water back then. They were the soul of the place, genuinely mesmerizing kids while parents could maybe snag a moment's peace. Operating out of Irving, Texas, Showbiz perfectly captured that early 80s energy. But even the best gigs end. As the initial arcade hype cooled and financial troubles crept in during the early 90s, keeping the lights on got tough. The inevitable happened in 1992. They merged with their competitor, Chuck E. Cheese. Gradually, all those Showbiz locations got a makeover, and the Rock-afire magic faded into legend. Still, what a time, right? Whatever happened to Winkys? You know how sometimes the best ideas happen almost by accident? That's pretty much the story behind the old Winkys fast food chain. It wasn't born from some grand corporate strategy. See, back around 1962, the Erlenstein brothers were simply in the meat supply business. Restaurants, including a growing client named McDonald's, were their customers, not the other way around. Watching McDonald's absolutely boom gave the brothers that classic light bulb moment. Wait a minute, maybe we could get in on this. So, they took the plunge and opened the first Winkys. Here's the really clever part. They used their own meat supply. By cutting out the middleman, they kept their costs down right from the get-go, giving them a neat advantage. People took notice, and Winkys started popping up, eventually growing to 42 restaurants across 3 different states. They really had something going for a while. But, as often happens in the business world, things changed. By the early 80s, the fast food scene got incredibly crowded and competitive. Making a solid profit became much harder. Despite their smart start and impressive growth, Winkys just couldn't keep pace. The company sadly ended up filing for bankruptcy, and the once promising chain faded into restaurant history. Remembering Royal Castle. Alright, let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we? Way before the Golden Arches seemed to be on every corner, there were unique regional spots that really had character. One standout was Royal Castle. It all started back in 1938 down in sunny Miami. Now, Royal Castle wasn't trying to be complicated. Their magic was in simplicity. Delicious little burgers that hit the spot, frosty mugs brimming with cold root beer, and something you wouldn't expect today, real, freshly squeezed orange juice. That juice was a legend. Breakfast was a big deal there too, so whether morning, noon, or night, you got that classic, friendly vibe. They did pretty well for themselves, expanding beyond Florida into states like Louisiana, Georgia, and even reaching up to Ohio. At their height, they were operating about 175 restaurants, holding their own in that growing fast food world. But things started changing around 1969 when a company called Performance Systems bought them out. Unfortunately, that marked the beginning of the end. Competition was heating up fiercely, especially from the big players like McDonald's, and Royal Castle started losing ground and money. Eventually, the tough reality hit, and nearly all locations had to close. Today, if you want a taste of that history, you have to go back to where it started. Just one lone Royal Castle still stands in Miami, a true time capsule serving nostalgia alongside its burgers. Before fast food was fast, remember, Childs? Alright, let's rewind the clock way back, even before the golden arches started dotting the landscape. There was a genuine trailblazer in the American restaurant scene called Childs. Kicking off in New York City way back in 1889, Childs wasn't just another eatery. It was one of the very first restaurant chains this country ever saw. Now, what made Childs revolutionary for its time? It was their almost obsessive focus on things we take for granted now. Sparkling clean kitchens and dining areas, reliable food that tasted the same no matter which location you visited, and efficient, organized service. Think about it, they were laying down the blueprint that future fast food giants would eventually build upon. And boy, did they grow. Childs stretched far beyond NYC, eventually setting up shop in nearly 30 cities across the United States, and even dipping into Canada. During their heyday in the 1920s and 30s, they boasted around 125 bustling spots. It offered folks a dependable dining experience. But, as the story often goes, times changed. New competitors emerged. Childs tried to adapt, bringing in novelties like hot dog machines and even chefs flipping pancakes out where everyone could see. While maybe fun, these efforts couldn't reverse the tide. The business slowly dwindled, and by the late 1960s, this pioneering chain had closed its doors for good. Still, Childs definitely helped shape the way we all eat out today. Let's talk about another name from the fast food archives, Carroll's. Launched back in 1960, they certainly had a unique way of getting noticed right out of the gate. Their first mascot? Brace yourselves, it was a bright yellow slug. Yes, a slug. Definitely quirky, maybe a head-scratcher, but it sure made people look twice. Eventually, perhaps wisely, they ditched the slug for a more conventional image, a friendly little blonde boy sporting a fedora, aiming for that classic family vibe. Enter Herb Schlotnick. He acquired the rights to Carroll's and saw a real opportunity brewing, especially with the buzz around 15-cent hamburgers back then. Herb dove right in, pushing the franchising model aggressively. For a time, Carroll's was definitely expanding its footprint, serving up burgers in various regions and gaining some traction. However, as the fast food landscape got more and more crowded, Carroll's found it increasingly difficult to compete effectively. The writing was on the wall, and the last Carroll's restaurant eventually closed down in 1980. But here's where the story gets interesting. Herb's holding company didn't just fold. They made a very savvy pivot, transitioning into the Burger King franchise system and later adding Popeyes to their operations. Today, that same company thrives, owning and managing over 1,000 Burger King and Popeyes locations. It's a great example of how sometimes adapting the business strategy is the key to long-term success, even if the original brand doesn't survive. That time Minnie Pearl sold chicken. Alright, let's jog the memory banks back to the 1960s, the era when fried chicken places were really hitting their stride. Amidst all that, remember Minnie Pearl's chicken? Yes, indeed. Named after the famous Grand Ole Opry comedian, Minnie Pearl, you know, the one with the iconic hat and the howdy greeting. Now, let's be clear, Sarah Ophelia Cannon, which was her real name, wasn't back there frying chicken herself. She essentially lent her beloved personality and image to the brand, hoping to give it some of that authentic Southern charm to compete. Launched with big ambitions in the 60s, the main goal was clear: take a bite out of KFC's market share. And wow, did it look like they were succeeding initially. The chain's growth was absolutely explosive, expanding to something like 567 franchised restaurants in just a blink, it seemed. On the surface, it looked like the next huge fast food success story. But behind that folksy facade and rapid expansion, trouble was brewing. Growing that fast stretched their finances incredibly thin. Keeping up operationally and competing effectively against the established powerhouse of Kentucky Fried Chicken proved impossible. The bubble burst spectacularly in 1968 when the company had to admit it was swimming in about $1.2 million of debt. And just like that, the Minnie Pearl's chicken empire crumbled, disappearing almost as quickly as it rose. Which of these chains feels like the biggest blast from the past to you? And why does it stick in your mind? When Walgreens served pancakes, the Wags story. Picture this. You walk into Walgreens, but instead of heading for the pharmacy, you slide into a booth for pancakes and coffee. Sounds strange now, right? But back in the 1970s, Walgreens actually ran its own chain of 24-hour diners called Wags. Yeah, seeing the success of places like Denny's, they decided to jump into the all-night, sit-down restaurant game themselves. Wags was tailor-made for weary travelers needing a highway break, folks working odd hours, or just families looking for a reliable, casual spot any time of day. And they did pretty well for a while. At their peak, there were 91 Wags restaurants dotted across the country, usually strategically located near busy roads and intersections. You knew what you were getting: straightforward, satisfying American diner food. We're talking big breakfast platters morning, noon, or night, classic hamburgers hot off the grill, and endless cups of coffee. It was that comfortable, predictable neighborhood diner vibe, open around the clock. But priorities change. In 1988, Walgreens decided to get back to focusing purely on their drugstore empire and sold most of the Wags chain to the Marriott Corporation. They kept a few, mostly in malls, but the brand started to fade under new management. After changing hands again, the final Wags locations closed up shop by 1991. Some even flipped into IHOPs, but the Wags name itself became just a memory of when a pharmacy chain tried its hand at flapjacks. Remembering Bob's Big Boy. You know that iconic statue, right? The cheerful kid in red and white checkered overalls hoisting the huge burger? That's Bob's Big Boy, a true piece of American roadside history. It all started much simpler, though, back in 1926 in Southern California with a single diner called Bob's Pantry. The founder, Bob Wyan, hit on something big literally when he created the double-decker hamburger. It was revolutionary for the time, a total smash hit that helped launch the whole chain. For decades afterwards, Bob's Big Boy restaurants were popping up across the country. They were more than just quick burger joints. They felt like real neighborhood hubs, comfortable spots where families gathered, always welcomed by that famous smiling statue out front. It was a place with a certain feel to it. But times changed. The fast food world got fiercer with more competition, and the once widespread presence of Big Boy began to shrink significantly across the map. It's definitely faded from the national scene we once knew. Today, only 5 restaurants still fly the original Bob's Big Boy banner, though the official restaurant group is still active, working to keep that classic taste and a piece of that legacy alive for folks today. Remembering Dee's Drive-In. Before every corner had a fast food joint, Utah had something special: Dee's Drive-In. This beloved spot kicked things off way back in 1932 in Salt Lake City. The guy behind it, D. Frederick Anderson, actually got his start flipping burgers while he was still in college at the University of Utah. He figured out pretty quick he was good at it, and boom, the first Dee's was born. Dee's just hit the spot for folks back then. You know, classic American grub, car hops rolling up to your window. It was the real deal. It wasn't just one little place, either. The chain grew and grew, eventually hitting 53 locations and, get this, pulling in about $20 million a year when it was really flying high. For anyone who grew up in Utah during that time, Dee's wasn't just burgers and fries. It was part of life, the backdrop for a lot of good times. But, unfortunately, the story takes a turn. Around the early 2000s, some serious trouble surfaced: major sexual harassment lawsuits against the company. Those legal battles cost them a fortune, millions, and really did a number on their reputation. The pressure mounted, and sadly, Dee's just couldn't hang on. The last one shut down for good in 2005. Sure, some of those buildings later became Walgreens, but ask anyone who remembers pulling into Dee's, nothing quite replaced it. Howard Johnson's. Before there was McDonald's, before the golden age of drive-thrus, there was Howard Johnson S.A., a true pioneer in American roadside dining. It all began in 1925 with a modest soda stand in Quincy, Massachusetts. The man behind it, Howard D. Johnson, had a simple goal: offer quality food at a fair price. That little stand served up 28 flavors of ice cream and quickly became a local favorite. After surviving the Great Depression, Johnson didn't just bounce back, revolutionize the industry. By opening a second location, he unknowingly helped launch one of the first franchised restaurant chains in America. Howard Johnson's became known for its bright orange roofs, reliable food, and welcoming dine-in service, something that set it apart long before fast food chains became the norm. At its peak in the 1950s, there were over 400 locations scattered across the U.S., often found along highways and in busy towns. In 1954, Howard Johnson's took a bold leap into hospitality by turning many of its restaurants into motor lodges, catering to families and travelers looking for clean, affordable lodging. Though the last restaurant closed its doors in 2017, the Howard Johnson brand lives on through its motor lodges, now owned by Wyndham Hotels. A true piece of Americana, frozen in time. Oh, the noise at Farrell's. Alright, let's talk about a place that was pure sensory overload for kids back in the day, Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor. If you were around in the 60s or 70s, you know this name. Started in 1963 up in Portland, Oregon, by Bob Farrell and Ken McCarthy, it wasn't just about scoops, it was an event. Imagine stepping into a whirlwind of early 1900s charm, player pianos banging out tunes, staff zipping around in those classic striped vests, and straw boater hats. It felt less like a restaurant and more like a joyous, time-traveling party. And the birthdays. My goodness, they didn't just give you a free sundae. They practically stopped the presses. Drums would start banging, maybe even a siren would wail, and the whole crew would gather round, singing at the top of their lungs. Talk about making a kid feel like the center of the universe for a few glorious, noisy minutes. That electric atmosphere was everything. Farrell's caught on like wildfire, expanding to about 120 locations across the country by the mid-70s. But, as often happens, the magic couldn't last forever. Economic shifts in the 80s took their toll, and locations gradually vanished. The very last holdout, in Brea, California, closed in 2019. Marcus Lemonis holds the brand now. Maybe someday that sweet chaos will return. It's funny how things change, isn't it? What's one thing you think today's fast food places are missing compared to those spots we grew up with? Kenny Rogers Roasters. Cast your mind back to the early 90s. Country superstar Kenny Rogers wasn't just dominating the radio waves. He decided to try his hand at chicken. In 1991, he launched Kenny Rogers Roasters, aiming for that comfy, home-style feel with rotisserie chicken and all the fixings. Now, this wasn't completely out of left field. Kenny actually had a good nose for business. He'd made a smart move investing early in KFC, so he figured he'd give his own chain a shot. The whole idea was pretty simple: good, slow-cooked chicken and familiar sides in a place that felt welcoming. And you know what? People dug it. The chain really took off for a while, expanding to around 425 spots across the US and even internationally by the mid-90s. Heck, it even got that famous shout-out on Seinfeld, remember that? That certainly didn't hurt its popularity. But, despite that strong start, keeping the flame going here in the States proved tough. By 1999, the American locations had pretty much all closed up shop. Here's the twist, though. While it faded here, Kenny Rogers Roasters found a second life overseas, especially in Asia. Believe it or not, there are still over 150 of them thriving today. So, Kenny's gone, but his chicken legacy? It's still cooking somewhere. Remember Steak and Ale? Let's talk about a place many of us probably remember fondly, Steak and Ale. Back in 1966, a fellow named Norman Brinker kicked things off down in Dallas, Texas. His big idea was pretty smart for the time. He thought, why can't regular folks get a really decent steak dinner, something a step up, without paying an arm and a leg? So he created Steak and Ale specifically to fill that sweet spot, definitely nicer than your average burger joint, but still comfortable and affordable for a family or a date night. Sure, the steaks were the main event, but what really gave Steak and Ale its character, I think, was the whole atmosphere. Remember those buildings? They were designed to look like an old English Tudor pub, lots of dark wood, cozy booths, and that dim, moody lighting. It genuinely felt a bit special, like a proper night out, but thankfully without the stuffy vibe or the hefty price tag. And let's be honest, who could forget that salad bar? They were one of the early champions of the generous, all-you-can-eat salad bar, and people absolutely loved loading up their plates. They had good burgers and sandwiches too, rounding things out. It really caught on, eventually growing to about 280 restaurants nationwide at its peak. Big companies noticed. Pillsbury ended up buying the chain. But sadly, like a lot of businesses discovered, good times don't always last. When the financial crisis really hit hard in 2008, the parent company filed for bankruptcy, and just like that, all the remaining steak and ala shut down for good. A real shame for a place with such a unique feel. Gridiron and Grills, Gino's Hamburgers. Alright, football fans might remember this name, Gino Marchetti. Hard-hitting defensive end for the old Baltimore Colts back in the day. Well, in 1959, he and teammate Alan Amich decided to try their hand off the field, opening up Gino's Hamburgers right there in Baltimore. It wasn't just another burger stand. It had a bit of star power behind it, you know? People knew who these guys were. And the food delivered. Two Ginos got famous for really juicy burgers and some seriously good crispy fried chicken. It had that classic fast food feel, but just felt solid. No nonsense, just good eats. They clearly knew what they were doing because the chain blew up, eventually spreading to nearly 360 locations across the map. So where did it go? Well, big business stepped in. In 1986, Marriott Corporation bought them out, but their main goal was to expand their other chain, Roy Rogers. So, gradually, the Gino signs came down, replaced by Roy Rogers, and a fan favorite just sort of vanished. Remember Bennigan's Happy Hour? Let's talk about another one from the memory banks, Bennigan's. They popped up back in 1976, right around when those themed casual restaurants started becoming a big deal. Bennigan's really leaned into that Irish pub kind of vibe, didn't they? You know, lots of dark wood, brass rails, that cozy, dimly lit feel. It was the spot where you could comfortably grab a beer at the bar, share some loaded potato skins, a classic, or tackle that legendary deep-fried Monte Cristo sandwich. Through the 80s and 90s, Bennigan's was really firing on all cylinders. They managed to nail that sweet spot between being a decent restaurant for the family and a great hangout for happy hour after work. While places like Chi-Chi's had the Fiesta thing going, Bennigan's offered that comfy, Irishish pub atmosphere paired with hearty American food people loved. It just worked. But then, as we rolled into the 2000s, things started to slide. The restaurant scene got more crowded, tastes changed, and Bennigan's seemed to struggle to keep up with the times. It all came crashing down in 2008 when the company filed for bankruptcy. A whole bunch of the company-owned restaurants basically shut their doors overnight, just gone. While some franchise spots managed to survive, and a few have even tried to make a comeback under new ownership, it never really bounced back to being that nationwide chain we all remember. Today, there are just a few Bennigan's left, a real shadow of its former self. What happened to Chi-Chi's? Who remembers Chi-Chi's? Back around 1974, they burst onto the scene, owned by Hormel actually, with a plan to bring Mexican food to the masses. And for a lot of us, it worked. Think about those sizzling fajita platters coming to the table, the crispy chimichangas, and, of course, those never-ending baskets of chips and salsa. For many Americans, Chi-Chi's was probably their first real taste of that kind of food, and they really made a splash. At their peak, they had about 210 locations spread across the country. It became a go-to spot, didn't it? Great for family dinners, birthday parties, maybe a few too many margaritas on a Friday night. The restaurants usually had a fun, lively vibe. The portions were definitely generous, and for a good stretch, business was humming along nicely. But then, things took a devastating turn. In 2003, right after they'd already filed for bankruptcy protection, Chi-Chi's became the center of the largest hepatitis A outbreak in American history. It was eventually traced back to contaminated green onions served at one location. The human cost was terrible. Over 600 people fell ill, and tragically, 4 people died. Between the lawsuits and the massive damage to their reputation, there was just no coming back. By 2004, all the U.S. restaurants were shuttered for good. The strange epilogue? The Chi-Chi's brand still exists. Overseas, you can find them in places like Austria and Kuwait. A really unfortunate end for a chain that was once so popular here. Chevy's and that tortilla machine. Remember back in the 80s when Chevy's Fresh Mex rolled onto the scene? They really tried to shake things up from your standard Mexican joint. Their whole gimmick, and it was a pretty good one, was freshness. The big showstopper was that tortilla machine El Machino, right? Parked right out front where you could actually watch them making your tortillas from scratch. That really hammered home the Fresh Mex idea they were pushing. And the vibe inside matched. It was usually pretty lively, lots of bright colors. Definitely a fun spot for families or grabbing drinks after work. You knew what you were getting. Those sizzling fajitas everyone loved, margaritas that were definitely not small, and naturally, endless baskets of chips and salsa to keep you busy. For a while there, Chevy seemed to be popping up everywhere. Dozens of locations across the country promising that fresh approach. But keeping that magic alive proved tough over the years. The company changed hands a few times, and often that leads to cutbacks and locations closing down. Plus, the whole restaurant world keeps changing, and Chevy seemed to struggle to stay ahead of the curve. You can still find a handful of them out there today, but it's definitely a much smaller footprint than back in its heyday. Peanuts on the floor, remembering Ground Round. Alright, let's talk about a real family classic for many of us, Ground Round. Remember that place? It kicked off back in 1969, actually started by the Howard Johnson Company. The whole idea was pretty straightforward. Make eating out casual, fun, and easy on the wallet, especially for families with kids. What really made Ground Round stick in your memory were those little extras. Like the big buckets of peanuts right on the table, and yeah, you were actually encouraged to just toss the shells on the floor. Total chaos, but kids loved it. Plus, they usually had cartoons playing somewhere to keep the little ones distracted while the grown-ups could actually unwind for a minute. The menu was dependable burgers, ribs, simple stuff that hit the spot. They often had a separate bar side and a family dining area, making everyone feel welcome. They really took off in the late 70s and 80s, spreading across the country. But, as we've seen with others, the restaurant world got tougher. More competition popped up, times changed, and after some ownership shuffles and money problems, Ground Round filed for bankruptcy in the early 2000s. Most locations shut down pretty quickly. A few independent ones are still kicking around, but the nationwide chain we remember largely faded away. El Torito, a California classic. Especially for those who grew up in California, you probably remember El Torito. This place goes way back, starting in Southern California in 1954. Its name means the little bull, but it really made a big splash. El Torito was one of the pioneers, bringing a full sit-down Mexican dining experience to the mainstream when that wasn't nearly as common. They kind of wrote the playbook with the colorful decorations, maybe some mariachi tunes in the background, just creating that fun, festive atmosphere. It was the whole experience. People went for loading up on those combo platters. The drama of sizzling fajitas arriving at your table, never-ending chips and salsa, and you definitely couldn't forget the margaritas. It hit that sweet spot, perfect for family meals, but also great for a date night or celebrating something. Through the 80s and 90s, El Torito was a fixture in California and even started branching out elsewhere. But, like many chains we've talked about, El Torito hit some bumpy roads. Ownership changes, multiple bankruptcies. It led to a lot of locations closing down over time. They're still around today, though mostly back in their California home base, just not the nationwide presence they once aimed for. Still, you have to appreciate how they helped introduce so many Americans to Mexican food beyond just tacos. Don Pablo's Fiesta fades. Alright, let's talk Tex-Mex memories. Remember Don Pablo's? They burst onto the scene back in 1985 and really aimed to bring the party along with the fajitas. Going there wasn't just dinner. It felt like a bit of an event, didn't it? The restaurants were always decked out in bright colors. The music was usually turned up, and let's just say the margaritas were definitely noticeable. It quickly became one of the really popular Tex-Mex chains. People loved watching those fresh tortillas being made, the sizzle of the grilled meats, and those big platters piled high with nachos or enchiladas. It was that reliable spot for family birthday dinners, or maybe grabbing drinks and appetizers with coworkers after a long day. At their peak, they had locations scattered all over, all pushing that high-energy, flavorful vibe. But behind all the sizzle, the business side started to struggle. The company changed hands multiple times and seemed to battle ongoing money problems and mismanagement. They tried rebranding or tweaking things a few times, but couldn't quite recapture the magic or keep pace with competitors. After a couple of bankruptcy filings, the music finally stopped in 2019 when the last few Don Pablo's restaurants closed their doors for good. From Gino's Burgers to the Chi-Chi's Fiesta, these 20 chains represent a diverse, often vanished, part of dining history. Which memory resonates most with you? Share your favorite forgotten spot in the comments. If you enjoyed this nostalgic look back, please subscribe, like this video, and share it.